Are we on the verge of having a 51st state? We're going to talk about that on Stopping Socialism TV. But before we get into that topic, I have to always encourage every one of these videos starts off the same. I gotta put out that message. If you want to make sure that more people see this content, hear this content, it's up to you, because Facebook, Google, YouTube, they're not going to help us. So the only way that more people will see it is if you like it, you share it, you subscribe to it, you get that message out there. It's a great help for us. It doesn't cost you a thing. So help us out. But Justin, you were just telling me about this story, and I thought, hey, we should do a video on this. We might be having a 51st state. What's going on?
Yeah, so today, when we're filming this video, which is April 22nd, the House of Representatives, the U.S. House of Representatives, voted on a bill to grant statehood to Washington, D.C. So assuming that the Senate actually approves this, it would create another state, Washington, D.C., which is already that overwhelmingly supports the residents of Washington, D.C., overwhelmingly support becoming a state. There are about 700,000 people that live in Washington, D.C. This, if approved by the Senate, by the U.S. Senate, this would make Washington, D.C. the 51st state. Washington, D.C. is one of the most far left states that there are, which is not surprising since it's the home to government workers, a massive number of government workers. They would get the full rights of a state, meaning they would get at least one member of the House of Representatives, and they would get 2 senators, U.S. senators, and they would also get electoral college votes in the U.S. presidential election. So a lot at stake, especially in the Senate. That's the main reason people are concerned about this, of course. And it's totally insane. It's totally insane. There's absolutely no justification for Washington, D.C. becoming a state. It makes literally no sense on any ground whatsoever. It's an obvious power grab by people on the left. And if it is successful and Washington, D.C. does become a state, then it is going to be extremely difficult for Republicans to ever win the Senate again. It's not impossible, of course, but it would be very, very hard for them to do that because it's 2 guaranteed Democrat votes in the Senate in perpetuity. Because, of course, Washington, D.C. will probably, as long as it's the home to the federal government, it will probably always be a left-leaning area. And it's incredibly problematic. Before we get your take, because I do want to get your take on this, and especially to find out how concerned you are about this. But there was this quote from someone who was involved in the vote on this. This was from this is a delegate from Washington, D.C., so they support this. They obviously didn't vote on the U.S. House bill, but the quote was, "This country." This is from a NPR story, by the way. The quote is, "This country was founded on the principles of no taxation without representation and consent of the governed. But D.C. residents are taxed without representation and cannot consent to the laws under which they as American citizens must live." This is Eleanor Holmes Norton. This is the district's non-voting delegate in the House of Representatives. So Washington, D.C. already has representation in Congress, but it's a non-voting delegate. So this is what this individual was saying. So the country was founded on the principles of no taxation without representation and consent of the governed. So although that's true, what's interesting about that is the country was also founded so that Washington, D.C. wouldn't be a state. That was what the founders set up when they created the country. That was also what the country was founded on. So the idea that we're going to go back to the founders and say, oh, well, the country was founded on this idea that, everyone should have a vote. Well, not in Washington, D.C. That was part of the deal. So
wait. I don't know history as well as you do. So let me get back to that point. But you mentioned earlier that this doesn't make any sense. But to me, and I'm not necessarily playing devil's advocate. I'm just hearing some of this for the first time. So I'm just curious what the answers are. One thing that didn't ever make sense to me is we're called the United States of America. Does that exclude Washington, D.C.? Because it's not the United States of America and Washington, D.C. So it's just are they not even included when we're talking about the United States? So it always, like, I never understood why Washington, D.C. was this little separate entity, and, like, why it couldn't just be folded into another state. That's kind of my
Right.
first question here.
Sure. So from a historical perspective, the reason why Washington D.C. was not a state was because when the country was founded, and for most of American history up until relatively recently, states had a lot more power and authority to govern themselves in a variety of different ways, right? That's what the 10th Amendment is all about. The 10th Amendment is essentially says that those responsibilities and rights not explicitly given to the federal government are reserved to the states and to the people, okay? So the idea that the founders had was that states were going to settle their own affairs, right? So one of the main issues that states had before you had the passage of the Constitution and the ratification of the Constitution, so this is after you had the Revolutionary War, Americans have won, they now have to decide how they're going to build a national government, if they're going to have a national government at all. Or are we just going to have a bunch of states, a bunch of, separate, the colonies at that time, were they going to become essentially separate countries? Or are we going to have some kind of unity? What are we going to have here? So before we had the Constitution passed and ratified, we had the Articles of Confederation. So we had a confederation of these states, okay? And it was a really weak confederation. What we would think of today as the national government really didn't have any power at all. States could pretty much just ignore them. They didn't have to provide funding if they didn't want to. It was kind of a voluntary association of states, not a federal government. So there were all kinds of problems that were occurring as a result of this situation. And a lot of people involved with the creation of the country understood that we had to have a national government if we were going to protect ourselves from future invasions from the United Kingdom, if we were going to protect ourselves from France and from foreign powers, the Spanish, other people who were involved. We had to have a national government if we were going to have a well-functioning commerce system. We had to have interstate commerce. We couldn't have a bunch of states that were going to have their own currency and their own laws and regulations and rules for commerce. So there was this desire to have a country, but we couldn't really agree on how that was all going to work itself out. And one of the main things that people were concerned about is the smaller states in particular were worried that if they signed themselves over to this new country, that the bigger, more powerful, well-established states would basically just do whatever they want, and they would force all these smaller states to go along with it. So that was really one of the big issues early on in the country's founding. So, of course, one of the things that they were concerned about is, well, where's the capital going to be of this? Who's going to be in the capital? How influential are those people going to be? And one of the big issues they had to deal with was, well, if the capital is in, let's say, Virginia or Boston, or Massachusetts and Virginia were some of the bigger states and more powerful states at the time, or New York, let's say, does that mean that Virginia is going to have an outsized amount of power over national affairs? How is that going to work? What if someday Virginia secedes from the Union, which it did, by the way, later on? Does the national capital and all the buildings go with it? What happens if this occurs? So these were all things that they were worried about. So the compromise was, well, let's have a national capital seat of government that isn't really beholden to any one state. It's its own separate entity that isn't involved in the affairs of all these other things. It's basically just going to be this place that's sole purpose is to function as the seat of government for this national government that we're going to create. And that's all it's going to be. It's not going to be anything more than that. And again, it's just a city. It's not meant to be a massive piece of land. It's not meant to be this highly populated area. The idea was just to have this relatively modest size city with some, land on the outskirts of it to give it a little bit of a buffer zone that would serve as the seat of as the capital for this new country, but not be beholden to any one state or one part of the country. That's another reason why it was located where it was. It's right at the sort of dividing line of North and South, which was another big issue, the northern states and the southern states. It's located where it is for a reason. It's autonomous in a way for a reason. It's not part of a state for a reason. There were all sorts of reasons for why they made it that way. Now, maybe you don't think any of those reasons matter anymore, but those reasons exist. They existed. It wasn't just this sort of crazy idea. I mean, there were real logical explanations behind it.
That's actually the better explanation that I've ever heard before. So I thank you for educating me on that. I kind of do actually dream of a day when it does become a state and it does secede from the rest of the United States. That would be nice. But, you started off all of this talking about how, with becoming a state, they'll get 2 senators and, those senators will clearly be Democratic senators, right? And I feel like that's going to be the main takeaway if you were to turn on Fox News or something like that. That would be the first thing that they go to. And I wonder if that's kind of like an ideologically inconsistent point of view, because like if we had some alternate universe where DC was very conservative for whatever reason, and it becoming a state would mean that there was going to be a guaranteed 2 more Republican senators, in the Senate. Like, would that change your mind on all of this?
Well, the interesting thing is, I mean, theoretically, any state, any place in America could theoretically become its own state. All that has to happen is the state in which that piece of land is already a part of. So, for example, let's say a part of Texas, right? Texas is a huge state. Let's say a part of Texas wants to be its own state. There's no reason why Texas couldn't say, okay, well, we're going to allow this little part of land to become its own state as long as Congress agrees to it. That could already happen. And it doesn't. It hasn't. So in other words, the Republicans could have done this a million times, and they didn't do this.
What if this kicks off some type of arms race type of thing? When we talked about like stacking the court, right? We talked about that before. If Joe Biden and his crew put 4 more justices on the Supreme Court, then what's going to stop the next Republican president from putting 4 more or 8 more or something like that? It's going to cause some arms race. Well, what if DC becoming a state does encourage places like Texas to start breaking off chunks and becoming, South Texas and East Texas? Like, that might actually not be a terrible thing.
Because in order for it to become a state, it has to be approved by Congress. And the whole idea behind doing this is they'll never lose control of Congress, so it will never happen. They might make more states for themselves, like say Puerto Rico could become a state, and that's another 2 votes for Democrats. And then maybe they find some other part of the country that they could break off and make into a state, make that a state too, and they'll never lose the Senate. The Senate will be run by them forever. That's the I think the fear is that, ideally. In the past, when they've done this, when we've had new states added, it's very common to add 2 states at a time. And usually it's part of a compromise. Whereas, one party gets 1 state, another party gets another state. Now, obviously, that's not how it's supposed to work, but in effect, that is how it works, right? And so for a long time, there were compromises related to slave states versus not slave states. Then there were compromises related to politics, right? And so oftentimes you had these ideological compromises where you would add 1 state and then either at the same time or shortly thereafter add another state of the opposing ideology so that you could bring new states into the union without tilting the balance of power in favor of 1 state or another state. But that's not what they're trying to do here. What they're trying to do here is tilt the balance of power in their favor and then never lose it, and tilt it so much in their favor that they can't lose it, and that we could never tilt it back without some dramatic shift in our favor in terms of demographics. And by the way, that doesn't look like that's going to happen. If anything, it looks like the opposite is happening, where the demographics are favoring the Democrats, because you're getting Democrats leaving places like California and New York and moving to traditionally Republican states. And as they move into those states are becoming more liberal and they're becoming more in favor of the Democratic Party. So in Colorado, for example, longtime Republican stronghold for decades and decades and decades, it's always been a conservative state, is now a deep blue state, never votes Republican anymore. And that was because lots of people left California and moved there. Arizona, which has historically been a very Republican state, is voting for Democrats now all the time. It's very common for them to vote for Democrats. They're a truly like 50-50 state now. Texas is barely voting for Republicans in a lot of these elections now. Ted Cruz almost lost Texas to Beto O'Rourke not that long ago. So
don't remind me of that.
So the demographics are shifting in favor of Democrats, in addition to them trying to create new states. So if they actually did go forward and make DC a state, it would be so hard for us to overcome that. If they made DC a state and Puerto Rico a state, which is the other place they're trying to make a state, and that would require the people of Puerto Rico voting in favor of that, which might actually be the biggest roadblock to it, then now you've got 4 Democrats in the Senate overnight added to the Senate. How are we ever going to win the Senate again under those? That's the fear.
All right, last question. What is the actual chances of this happening? If you're a betting man, are you betting on this happening? Or are you thinking that it's not going to?
Are we talking ever, or are we talking now?
Short term, kind of in this ballpark, couple of years. Let's say Joe Biden's first term.
So I think that at present, there's probably 1, maybe 2 people in America that are standing in the way of this actually happening. And one of those people is Joe Manchin, is U.S. Senator from West Virginia, Democrat, who is maybe one of very few moderate Democrats in the Senate. I mean, maybe a couple of moderate Democrats in the Senate. He's the most moderate of them all. And he has said in the past that he will not support this. But that guy is going to get more pressure on him to support this now than ever before. And they'll be throwing all kinds of things his way to support doing this. All they need is basically him. If he goes along with it, DC becomes a state, because there'll be a tie in the Senate. It'll be 50-50 vote. And Kamala Harris, the president of the Senate, the vice president of the United States, breaks the tie in the Senate, and she'll break the tie in favor of making it a state. And then, of course, they'll have 2 extra votes shortly thereafter in the Senate, and then they won't need Kamala Harris to break ties anymore. So it basically comes down to Joe Manchin and maybe one other Democrat who says they don't want to go along with it. There are some who are, out there that are kind of wary of it. I will say that there are good reasons to think Joe Manchin won't do it. It does make me very nervous that it could come down to one guy in the whole country to decide whether this is a state or not. But Joe Manchin's from West Virginia, as I said before. West Virginia, although they vote for Democrats, not for president, but for, various state offices and for Congress and stuff, it's pretty common for them to do that. The Democrats that they vote for tend to be the old school, like 1960s, 70s, 80s Democrats. They're not like far left-wing people. Joe Manchin's not a far left-wing guy. And so they're like Reagan Democrat type people. And West Virginia consistently votes for Republican presidents. They've been doing that for a very long time. And so do the people of West Virginia, the kind of people who voted for Donald Trump, for example, and George W. Bush and all sorts of, do they want their senator making Washington, D.C. a state? No, probably not. And so I think that there's a good, especially considering Washington, D.C. is so close to West Virginia. And so they are well aware of how small and it is and how ridiculous it would be for that to be a state. I could imagine how they would be very opposed to that, and there would be a lot of pressure inside the state for Joe Manchin to not go along with it. Again, with that said, it still comes down to one guy pretty much, and anything can happen. And Democrats will sell their souls to get those 2 seats. So boy, there is going to be a lot of pressure on Joe Manchin. He probably has already made up his mind because he knew this was going to happen, I think. But man, there's going to be a lot of pressure on him to make the decision to make Washington, D.C. a state. So in the short term, I would say like 25% chance, maybe less than that, maybe slightly less than that. Long term, though, I mean, if Democrats win another seat in the Senate in the next election, they gain 1 more seat, maybe 2 more seats, it's a done deal. It's over. So
Well,
I think long term, you could argue there's a 50% at least chance of this happening, maybe much higher. Maybe long term, you could say 75% chance. It's just a matter of them getting the right number of seats in the Senate.
Well, we will definitely be keeping track of this. You can find more coverage of topics like this on stoppingsocialism.com. If you want to see more videos like this, obviously you can subscribe to our channel, Stopping Socialism TV, here on YouTube. You can also find most of our content spread across various social medias, whether it's Facebook, Stopping Socialism. We also have an Instagram account and a Parler account. Justin, where can the fine people find you?
At Justin T. Haskins on Facebook, on Socialist Twitter, and on Parler.
All right. Thank you all for tuning in. We will talk to you next time.